It's about helping to shape and frame the minds and the hearts to be able to address the myriad of things that are justice related in our culture.
It kind of becomes a blessing that you don't have enough resource to, feed 10,000 people in a food bank, but you can feed 60 families. So you will know them by name.
The good part of privilege is using and leveraging your resources for the sake of those who don't have the same.
What is me living in this place, me going to this school, me driving in this direction, me eating this food, me disposing this garbage, me, working where I work? How is this affecting my neighbor?
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Kanan Hurst, and this is episode 16, Seeking Shalom, Justice in the Small Church. Okay, so today on the podcast, we have Misha Cazas, who is the pastor of outreach and community care at the Westside Church Internacional, and Derrick Kelsey, pastor of Missional Communities at the Embassy Church. Both are small churches in the Denver area. Both are beautiful, diverse communities. I've been to both of your churches. I used to attend your church. And both are committed to seeing justice in the kingdom of God. And that's one of the many reasons that we're having you on this podcast today. So let's talk, before we get going in the conversation specifically around justice issues, let's just talk about each of your journeys in pastoring, how you got to where you are, and why you're in a small church right now.
Ladies first.
All right. All right. I was born and raised in La Paz, Bolivia, so I'm not American. I moved in 2017 after working for different Christian nonprofits, working in social justice, community development, people living in extreme poverty population, since I was 14 years old. And I was kind of like getting frustrated because of the lack of resources in my country and the lack of access to more preparation and training and that. So I prayed a lot, and God heard my prayer, and He opened every door for me to move to Denver Seminary. So in 2017, I moved to the U.S. and I started attending Denver Seminary, pursuing a master's in justice and mission. Graduated during the pandemic, but throughout my whole journey at Denver Seminary, I connected with Westside before Westside was actually put in place. So it was just kind of like an idea, and it was in the works. And so there were like vision nights where we would gather and pray for this upcoming church plant. And I felt very called since the very beginning. I started as a volunteer. Because of my visa, I couldn't start working right away, but I started as a volunteer. One of the things I did was engage with the young adults and support the young adult pastor at the time, and as a translator on Sundays, because all our Sunday services are in English, but we have simultaneous translation through headphones. So that's how I started, and getting more and more engaged with the justice work that they do. I ended up doing my internship from Denver Seminary my last semester. I worked as an intern, then the pandemic hit, and we had the crazy idea as a church plant to feed our whole community in a weekly food bank, which I thought it was impossible, but God was like, hold my beer, basically. And ever since then, it has been ongoing with other projects and ministries that we have over there. So I went from intern, then to director of outreach, and then to pastor of outreach and community care. So
that's awesome.
That's been my journey.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk a little bit more about Westside and the makeup of it, the people, and kind of the history of the church? I mean, you mentioned praying for it. You were there at the beginning. But what does your church look like today?
It's very diverse. I would say one of the things that I'm most proud about Westside is how much effort the founders have had since the very beginning to make everyone feel included and not kind of segregated within the same church. So not having Spanish service and then also English service, but working extra hard, putting extra resources for everyone to be sitting together next to each other, having breakfast before the service so everyone, it's so funny. Sometimes I see people that they sit down and then they look and they're like, oh shoot, I don't speak their language, and they find a way, during breakfast, and friendships and translators and stuff like that. So a lot of our community is immigrant, because we're in the 80219, I always forget the zip code, area, very low income, immigrant, African American, Latino, Vietnamese, white population. And it's a melting pot inside Denver, I feel like. And our church pretty much represents that, with white and Hispanic population being the biggest populations that we have. But low income, immigrant, very diverse.
Yeah. I actually was at your church on Sunday.
All right.
I
wasn't there. How was it?
It was great. It was amazing. I have never been before,
Okay.
unfortunately. And I was like, I really want to see this.
And it was a special Sunday.
It was a communion Sunday.
Yeah.
It was so beautiful. Amazing. It was amazing.
I'm so glad
to worship with, and in different languages.
Yeah.
What I love about what the worship and the music that you do is they'll sing a chorus in English and then do that same one in Spanish, and then go, in and out. And it just, the Spirit is really at work in your church, and it's a really beautiful.
Praise God.
Yeah.
And God bless our worship leader, because that's a hard work.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. But she puts all the effort. Sharonda was leading, I think, this Sunday, and she just does a magnificent job.
Oh my gosh, it was amazing.
Yeah.
All right, Derrick, what about you?
I'm a little bit older, so I have a little bit more story.
All right, go ahead.
No, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and in a traditional Black Baptist church in the South. And after college, after moving around a little bit for working in corporate America, I decided to quit my job and go to seminary in Dallas. So I went to Dallas Theological Seminary. And the church that I was going to there was a traditional Black Baptist church. And at that church, I met a fellow named Brandon Washington, who, after meeting him and forming a pretty quick friendship, after a year, he left to move to Denver to go to Denver Seminary. But that's the link that got me to Denver years later after I finished seminary. Didn't really know what I wanted to do when I grew up, and had an opportunity through my relationship with Brandon to help start the Embassy Church. And so I moved up to Denver to help plant the church. And when we planted the church, the area that we're in Northeast Denver, and the neighborhood that we were in was about 1/3 white, 1/3 Black, 1/3 Hispanic. And so we had wanted to plant a diverse church with the emphasis not just being on diversity, but diversity with integration. And so we came into the neighborhood, got that going. And while there, Denver experienced a huge influx of a population boom. And the neighborhood, especially being with its proximity to downtown, became less diverse. And we saw that being reflected in the church. So we thought in the beginning we would have a church that would naturally just reflect the neighborhood, and we would have diversity just by proximity. But those things changed over time, and so we had to really press into, so how are we going to maintain this diversity as we go forward? And it is a unique church. If you were to come on a Sunday, you would see primarily Black faces up front leading, but the congregation is majority white. And I'm sure there's not a lot of churches in America like that. So it's kind of interesting. And but by majority, I don't mean 80%, probably about 65% white, and then the rest is Black, Hispanic, and we've actually had a decent sized Asian American community that started coming. So it's a cool mix and a mosaic of several different cultures. What's also interesting is that in January, we're going to be merging with another church, and that church is a predominantly Black church. And so now we're going to continue to be a diverse church, but now the numbers are going to be a little bit probably more skewed toward Black in terms of the majority there. And so that's going to be an interesting thing, but it allows us to push even further and more deeply into this idea of diversity with integration. So excited about that. I helped to co-plant the church, and have been here for 11 years now.
That's great. Being in small churches, there are a lot of different responsibilities that everyone kind of has to take on. Talk about kind of what a normal week or month or day, is, if there's any kind of normalcy to it at all.
Oh, well, just to give you a reference, I'm the only full-time person at the church, so a lot of stuff falls in my plate. I think the main feeling on the daily basis is taking one hat off to put another one almost immediately.
Yeah.
So I'm like, if I'm preparing my sermon for Sunday and I'm done, or I need to be done for the day with that, then it's like immediately, I wish our minds worked that way, but I mean, I tried, okay, now I have to schedule the Sunday service and work with every area, so it's like, okay, forget about that for 1 second, and then it's all organizational right now and relational, and then, okay, the next day it's like, okay, let's take that off and then put the one for the food bank or the legal aid, and
Right.
So, and my husband is in charge of young adults, so then I have a lot of interaction with young adults, and I support him. Obviously, I don't get paid by that.
Yeah, right.
but that's just the wife support.
Yeah.
And there's also that, okay, I might be doing this thing, but then I need to take my hat off and do this. Or since I'm the only woman in the team that's in the pastor team that is bilingual, and that's able to do pastoral care, in our community, it's filled with women who only speak Spanish, for example,
right.
and they're so incredibly isolated. So to do home visitations, hospital visitations, and stuff like that. And so it's a mix of changing languages, changing, the hat that you're wearing that day. And sometimes, if you're interacting with kids in the community, you're obviously not going to be like bringing the theology the way you would do in your Sunday sermon,
Right.
that you need to have, your stack of commentaries and stuff like that. So it just feels like, do you guys say juggling?
Yes.
Yes. Oh
Yes.
my goodness. I feel like that every day. And also, again, being the only full-time person, I think it brings an extra layer and pressure that I have as well.
And kind of a loneliness too, right?
There
To the work.
is. Yeah. This must be like a couple of months ago, and I was like, you know what? I don't know where God is going to take me 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So I'm just going to record what it is like to go to work one day. And it was the saddest video of my life, because I walk into the building and there's no one. And I'm turning the lights on, and the gym where we have breakfast on Sunday, where it's packed, it's completely silent. Everything's dark. I go into, our office and no one's there. So that has been one of the hardest things that I feel like God has been teaching me since I started working at Westside, the loneliness of the work. And it's not like you find an immigrant woman of color that's a pastor in every corner. So there's an extra layer of loneliness of like, where do I seek for, this camaraderie or, this just like knowing each other and knowing what we're going through. So yeah, loneliness is a really big point. Yeah.
And both of you pastor in diverse pockets of a overwhelmingly white metro area as well. So that's, getting outside of where you pastor looks a lot different than where you are in there, I feel like.
Right.
What about you, Derrick?
Yeah. The juggling metaphor is apt because that is absolutely what it is. And there's no 2 days that are the same. So about 3 years into the church plant, I got the sense as we were looking at how the church was growing and the size that we were probably going to be, that we would not be large enough to support multiple people full-time on staff. And so because I had a tent making skill, and my wife was like, yo, we got to do something else.
Yeah.
Which I agree with. I went to look back and to leverage my background as an IT consultant. The Lord opened up a great door where I could work from home. And, I was doing work from home and Zoom like years before the pandemic was a thing. But that operates very seamlessly with what I do at the church because, I can be at home, I can be mobile during the day. and on some level can fit things around my work schedule. It's not like I need to be chained to a desk or into a cubicle for 8 hours in the day and then try to figure out what's going on. So that gives me a lot of flexibility. But my day often is set by, well, what meetings have I set? And then what emails come in that day. And so I had a week that was pretty crazy about 3 weeks ago, where on one day I got an email about the pastor who was supposed to come preach for us that Sunday wasn't going to be able to do it. So that meant that I needed to preach that Sunday. The next day I got an email from the school, and we meet at a school. So we don't have a building that we can go to every day. But I got an email from the school about, hey, can we switch the location within the school where we meet? And had to go back and forth around that to kind of advocate for us not to do that, given the fact there was no real AC going on during the summer. And then that Saturday night, got a text from our worship leader saying that he was sick and he wouldn't be coming.
Oh my gosh!
So it could be, that week I was just kind of like, okay, God, I see you gonna have to show up on Sunday because all of this is crazy. But it could go from anything from counseling appointments with married couples or premaritals to visiting someone who is sick and needs prayer. Sometimes you get some unusual requests. Somebody's like, hey, can you bring me communion for this? And so, these things, the days sort out what those activities will be. But it's never the same. But like you said, it's wearing many different hats in terms of the executive functions that you need to do at the church, the pastoral care that you need to do, some of those administrative things. So it just kind of depends on any day. But I tell people that I'm full time, regardless of how much I'm paid, regardless of whatever the hours, because it's as the needs show up and as things need to be taken care of, then we do that. And then on top of that, now we're working through this aspect of this marriage, we're calling, with this other church. And there's a whole nother set of meetings and conversations and organization that has to be done with that. And so those things are filling up our calendar as well.
Right. One thing I believe that's very interesting of working at a church, but I think in a church plan, you get to feel it more intensely, is the unexpected feels bigger and it feels just more impactful because you have your full week planned, right? And I am a big planner. I like writing everything down and seeing like, all right, how is this going to work? And that is the beauty also, because I would hate to work from like 8 to 4 sitting in a desk every single day. So I do like that dynamic, but you can feel like you have everything figured out and then you don't know what's going to happen. Either someone's not going to show up and you need to cover or find someone that will cover that, or an emergency in the community, and who are they going to call? It's you, and you can't say, sorry, today I actually have scheduled to write my sermon for Sunday, so I'm sorry, you're really sick, you can't do that, or like funerals, or like all those things, so the unexpected feels deeper in you, and then that you brought a great point. What happens when the hours you were supposed to work that week are done? That's the big struggle of like, but that the tension between self-care, but also the care of your sheep. It always feels like a struggle.
Yeah, you're on 24/7.
Right.
Yeah. What are kind of the most pressing justice issues? I know that's a big question with, and it's super broad and there are lots of different ones, but what are some of the most pressing you see in your church?
Yeah, that is a broad question. I think I'll answer it this way. For us, it is, given our size, so we're not going to have $1 million budget where we can and have 1,000 people we can mobilize, or 10,000 people we can mobilize toward attacking something at that level. So it's, for us, it's more about trying to help our people. How do they see, and what is the frame and the lens that they use to see what's going on in the world and to think about how they address these things. And that's probably the biggest impact that we can have, because we don't have the financial or the manpower resources. We want our people to be able to think from a lens of, what is biblical, what's theological, starting there versus starting the conversation with, well, what political party am I affiliated with? What the tradition that I grew up in, the community that I came from, and not having those things be the things that say, this is how you respond to that particular issue, but taking a step back and saying, well, what's Yahweh's way? Right. What is his way of thinking? What is his way of viewing this thing? And now seeing that, how do you dive into these things, not from not just a binary view of, well, we vote this way, so this is the way we see it, or my community has always been against or for this, and so that's what we do. But saying, given this perspective and this lens that's theologically formed, how then do you wade into these waters? And it may be more complex than the way that you have been previously taught, or maybe thinking about how to address those things. Yeah. So for us, it's not necessarily one particular hobby horse or the other, but it's about helping to shape and frame the minds and the hearts to be able to address the myriad of things that are justice related in our culture.
Yes, 100% agree. I think the concept of Imago Dei found in Genesis 1, it's core to, and it is one of our core values. And I think that's something that presses on everything that we do. With the community, with the church, is to regain that back, or remind people, or inform people for the very first time that is their original design. And anything that's happening that is not portraying that original design, it's something that we need to bring shalom towards, So it's a broad spectrum. I agree that every time you think you've got it, you don't. It's like, oh, right, I thought this would fix the problem, and it doesn't. But I think something that's I've been able to see very strongly is just kind of like the effect that charity has had in the past in our community, and how justice kind of brings some healing from that too, because I feel like charity, at least in the community around us, has created a shame mentality of receiving. We're the poor population, we're immigrants, and how do you bring hope while still meeting those needs that charity was trying to meet in a nice heart, but do not forget about Imago Dei, So we're not just constantly shaping our programs, constantly. I'm always seeking for any outreach event or any ongoing outreach to always have that in mind, that we're not here just to meet. You're not just here to grab some food. I'm an immigrant here, and I understand many of the things that these people go through, and a lot of the shame of like, wow, I used to speak I am able to speak really well in my language, but in this language, I'm like always asking and double checking, and so much of the shame that goes with that, and not being able to understand fully a new culture, So those walls that you hit, and how do you address that? So, at least with the food bank, I always think, I'm not going to buy anything I wouldn't want at my table, in my kitchen, and that I wouldn't feel so excited to go buy in the market, so bring about justice, and not saying, okay, have a bunch of canned food, when I wouldn't eat that all the time. Right. So that's the moment. Those are the moments where you switch from charity to justice, and it takes an extra layer, an extra effort, an extra expense, but it's so worth it because people feel seen, people feel heard. Same with the, I started a legal aid clinic, which we're in no way able to afford, but we were able to partner with an organization that was willing to do that. Cool. And that is like, those are the moments when you're like, yeah, as a pastor, you should probably never take my legal advice, Right. You don't want to. We would both end up in jail. But I can be the translator. I can be the communicator and the person in charge of the logistics for you to find that. And it just was a huge effort for people to build that trust in people, for they to just want to walk into our church to share immigration issues, domestic violence issues, and not feel like, oh, I might be deported, I might go to jail, like what's going to happen. Those are the moments where you're like, Imago Dei, your actual value, you're starting to experience that.
I think a lot of people don't understand what someone going through the immense and crazy process of immigration actually deal with. Can you talk about that a little bit as an immigrant, and why why people would be fearful to walk into a law office. Why, what has instilled those kind of fears that a lot of people or privileged people don't really think about.
Do you have a couple of hours?
We have as long as you need.
Well, I think the biggest fear is that no process is the same. The process to, the pathway that they say, at least in my case, I've been listening so many times people say like, oh, people should do it the right way, the right way. I'm an example of someone that's doing the right way. And trust me, it's not motivational at all. I cannot tell you how many times in my mind I thought, you know what? I think I just want to go home, so many times, if not on the daily basis for one thing or another.
The people who are saying do it the right way, could they even tell you what the right way is? I mean, I feel like a lot of the people who say just do it the right way don't even know what.
So they think, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but this is the comments I've got. Like, you come to the U.S., yes, we want you here, but go apply for a green card and come. That takes 13 plus years if you're lucky.
Wow.
And you need to keep status all that time. So to do that is incredibly difficult, and you have and it's so much money. It's so expensive. There's not a clear pathway. There's just so many things, and the U.S., I mean, comparing to many countries in the world, has so many opportunities, has so many resources. This is truly a very blessed country, and I love this country so much. But one of the things that drives me crazy is that because this pathway is not clear, and because as immigrants, I don't have a mom and a dad that's gonna say, oh, your car broke, let me go pick you up, let me pay for this, I don't. One of my biggest fears, and I actually had anxiety attacks when I first moved here, was if I get in a car accident, no one will know. My parents won't know, no one will know, because no one knows me in this country when I first arrived, right? And those things create such a huge fear, and I understand how much many of the women in our community are so incredibly isolated, because you're already learning how to put gas in your car, which is not the same way as in our countries. You have to go buy groceries you don't even know. I remember being terrified in the grocery store with the personal space in the U.S., which is a lovely topic. And people being like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, I'm literally 6 feet away from you. Like, how come, like, because in our countries that doesn't exist, and like all the things that you're learning that you're like, I just don't want to go anywhere because it feels safe for some reason to be here. And it's just a frustrating process. Me and my husband is Colombian, so we're both immigrants. He's still at seminary, and that has been one of the biggest nightmares. And to even think, we're obviously not saints, we're not perfect, but we're just like, if you think about it, all we want to do is to have the opportunity to work and to help in the U.S. That's what we came here for. That's where God sent us from. We met here, so he sent us from our countries to do that. So at some point, you're just like, would you just let me help? I'm trying to help your country because I love this country, and I feel like God called me here and sent me here clearly, and you're making it so incredibly difficult for me to do that. And for instance, this is an example. I had an emergency appendectomy. Ooh. Oh, actually, that was the day after I preached that Sacred Grace.
Oh my
that
gosh.
Night, or the day after. I think it was that night.
What?
And me and my husband I had been in pain for 3 days. And me and my husband waited until the very last second because we were like, you know what? We don't have insurance. And if we go, the debt is going to be so high. And, people are like, well, you're just going to take advantage of the government. Well, we can't. If you do it the right way, you cannot receive 1 cent from the government because that means you're a public charge. And we were like, okay, let's hope it's not that. And then I started getting worse and worse and worse. And we went to the hospital, and my appendectomy was $114,000 plus other bills. That was just the hospital. So once again, there's it's so many. It feels like layers and injuries of like, can I just work? And talking about the hat, that's another hat. You're like, okay, and now how do we make $114,000 because we cannot get help? And even the people in the hospital didn't know the process for us. They were like, just go to Medicaid. Don't worry. A lot of immigrants do that. They're going to pay for 90% of your bill. And we're like, we can't because we're trying to do things right.
Oh, right.
And we cannot, we have to deny, in the middle, like literally being taken to the ER, to the OR, I was like, please do not put us in Medicaid. Like, I'm literally like chasing that. Like,
Oh
please
my
do not,
gosh.
because we will be out of the country in a heartbeat if they find out.
Wow.
And I mean, obviously they're going to find out. So we were like, please do not do that. We will figure it out. Never in my mind did I think like an appendectomy would be $114,000.
Right.
You know, God worked his way and he made a miracle that we got a private discount, which was the only possible way this could have been fixed. But, you know, there's just so many layers, and
Thing after thing
people
after thing.
don't understand that depending on your status, you cannot work outside of that job. You know, you may have ideas of like, oh, what if I do this on the side and, you know, to help the community in this? You can't, because you cannot receive money from any other source. You know, my husband's working for his master's, but he's not allowed to work. So it's like, what do people think? Like, you just come with $1 million to the U.S. and are like, you know, I just feel like doing a master's,
Well,
you know?
people are just shocked at how expensive it is to come to this country the right way.
Oh, it's so expensive.
Yeah,
I've
and taking citizenship exams
Right.
and things that lots of citizens would never
Right.
be able to pass themselves.
Right. I've easily spent over $15,000 at this point just on the paperwork and the process, just in the process itself, not to count with lawyer,
the immigration
extra
attorneys,
hours, and all those things. And it's not over, trust
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. I'm so sorry to hear that. And
Thank
and there's even more that you didn't mention.
Yeah.
Derrick, for you, I know that in the community that you serve, I mean, everywhere, especially in Denver, is one of the worst, but everywhere is experiencing ridiculous gentrification, rising housing costs, lack of affordable housing, on and on and on. And you're in a historically Black and brown community that is rapidly turning very white and kind of homogenous. So can you talk about that and the challenges that come for those in your community?
Yeah. It's interesting to look at it just through the lens of the school. So we meet at a school, and I was actually having a conversation yesterday with a person who was who lived in the neighborhood, and his kids are a little bit younger than mine. So we move into the community in 2011, and our kids start going to schools at Denver Public Schools there in Northeast Denver. And pretty quickly, from being engaged in the school system, I saw that there was a lack of funding for these schools in that Northeast Denver corridor. And part of the reason was because of the lack of enrollment. But there were also other factors going on. And so there was a school that came into the neighborhood that got a charter to be a different school, a high quality education for elementary age kids in the neighborhood. And I ended up being on the board of that school, and because I was just really excited about having an opportunity to have a differentiated learning experience that you wouldn't typically see in the neighborhood. And that school was only open for like 4 years, because there's the challenges of any kind of startup entrepreneurial effort that, you know, you have this idea and you get it going, and then you realize, we got to change things up. And the way it looked on the whiteboard is not how it's actually going to be executed. But the thing that we didn't know was that how the gentrification that was happening in the neighborhood was going to actually affect the ability to even keep the school open. Because what happened is, as young white families or singles moved into the neighborhood, young people who were there as renters and their parents moved out of the neighborhood. And so we ended up being starved for kids at this school. And so we couldn't properly enroll the school, which means that we could not pay the mortgage. And so we had to close the school down, because every kid that comes into the school has a dollar figure on their head with federal money. And so we had to close the school. But we also saw in the school where the church met that they were having enrollment challenges as well. But because DPS effectively was subsidizing and the building was paid for and whatnot, you know, those schools were being able to stay open. But now you had them having to reduce their teaching sizes and staffs, and you had just real struggles with enrollment and finances. And there were some complications about not wanting to close schools down. And so it was just a big mess. But when I look at that situation, especially from a justice lens, I think about what is this neighborhood going to look like in 10 years when the families who moved into the neighborhood and those singles start getting married and they start having kids, and those schools that were struggling, having to cut back on teachers having to teach multiple grades, classroom sizes expanding, things of that nature, some schools even being shut down. Like, in 10 years, will these be thriving schools? And it's like, why? The school's in the same building, same zip code, but it's just a matter of who's living in the neighborhood. Now you're able to have a different educational experience. And so when I look at that, that's something that, it'll take time to see how that plays itself out. But that's a way that gentrification can have an effect on an area where kids either have a less than education experience or have to completely move somewhere else to get any education at all. And the place where they were living, if they just had the means to stay around or were born 10 years later and to the right, financial circumstances in that neighborhood, they could have a high quality education. So that's just kind of one way, just looking through the lens there. But yeah, the way the housing prices jumped in the early 2010s, and just seeing like houses going for 200, 300,000 more than they had been selling for 5 years later, and just knowing the financial question that's there. That's a house that maybe I grew up in, but I don't live in that neighborhood. Maybe my mom or my dad, who's getting up in age, lives in that house, or maybe they passed on. And so do we want to keep paying the property taxes on it? Somebody's going to, bring me a pretty nice check for that house. Well, do I take that? Or do I keep it to keep the house? But it's like, man, that's a lot of money. Yeah. And so I understand people taking that. It's very tempting to be able to make that exchange. Or for people who actually have their houses paid for, but because now the property values go up so high, now if you're on a fixed income, those property taxes going up has an effect on you. So it's not like, hey, I just need to go out and start working again. It's like, no, I'm retired. I'm done working. I'm on a fixed income, so it's harder for me to be able to pay that. And now at 70, do I need to try to go back into the workforce? Yeah. And so now that becomes a pressure to try to sell. So there are all kinds of economic consequences that happen. Yes, the neighborhood is nicer. Some coffee shops move into the neighborhood and some other things that make it a place where people want to live. But it's just disappointing that people who did live there aren't able to take advantage of some of the safety that's there, some of the new amenities, and have to leave because of financial circumstances that are beyond their control.
Right, like desirability of a neighborhood that's being gentrified, and not everyone is a homeowner, right? Or so renters.
Yeah, renters, yeah.
I mean, landlords are saying, I can charge so much more.
Right.
For this that I used to charge $1,000 less, but now there are people who are willing to pay. So from a purely economic standpoint, it makes sense to raise that rent, but fixed income folks, people who were barely able to afford it in the first place, are saying, I'm being pushed out. I got to go farther away or farther south or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's so hard.
Yeah.
Let's kind of pivot to a little bit to strengths of diversity in your churches. And Misha, I want to start with you because you're an immigrant. You lead a church that has a lot of immigrants and other folks, white folks, and like you mentioned beforehand, what about being an immigrant and having lots of Latinx immigrants in your church kind of gives it a character that is really valuable that a lot of American churches don't have. Can you talk about kind of the superpowers of having people from different countries?
Yeah, I think there's a level of being able to relate to one another without saying anything, because we understand, you don't have to explain to me. And I don't say that obviously in a prideful way. It's just like, I know, I see you and I understand, and we're in this together. So to also bring hope when many times as a church leader, as a spiritual leader, I feel hopeless, but to be able to pivot from that and bring about hope to people that are in many ways in the same situation that I am, and sometimes way better. And that's the challenge, to how to minister to people that are hopeless when you are in the same place as them, and also how to minister to people that are in a way more privileged level, but they're still looking for spiritual guidance, and you as a minority in a way less privileged level are put in, So, but I think being able to relate to those around the community, my husband, my mother-in-law lives right across the church, so she's in the community. My husband used to live with his mom there before we got married and we moved to Denver Seminary. So he's been in the neighborhood. We are in that neighborhood more than we are at Denver Seminary many times. We're like, we should just rent a room or something because, we just come here to sleep and that's pretty much it. We wake up and we're in that neighborhood again, Right. So there's a lot of solidarity that is built from that. And I think power, in a sense, to make a bigger impact, because if I understand what you're going through, I'm probably going to be able to address that pain in an easier way that if I didn't know and I'm just, going through trial or an error, The downside of that is that many times there's not enough voice to do that, or there's not enough agency because you are in those same shoes. Yeah. But yeah, there's just a big beauty to see a lady that's an immigrant and say like, wow, you could literally be my mom. So I'm going to treat you as such, because if my mom was right in front of a pastor, right in front of a church leader, this is how we want them to treat them, and not just say like, here's your bag of food, go, or like here, like sit down in the Sunday service. That's it. That's what church is like. But how do you bring shalom? Like, what are all the areas that I know you're going through and I also understand you might not even say, because I understand that culture as well, to like not say those things, but I know, and I'm going to see you and I'm going to address it, because without the opportunity of coming to Denver Seminary, that would be me as well. And also, for all I know, that's how they see me anyway. No one's going to be like, oh, but this Latina is here and this Latina is over here. Like, they're like, sometimes we joke with my husband, because there's so many stereotypes that they put on us. They think we're like a Mexican couple, and we're like, he's Colombian, okay, I'm Bolivian, we've never been in Mexico. And there's just so many stereotypes that they put on us that we're like, hey, give us a chance. There's so many more layers than being an immigrant. That feels like that's the identity that's put on you, and it's like, you don't know my story, you don't know what I've been through, where I'm coming from. So when you have someone that you can relate to at that level, it's so beautiful, because it just makes it so much easier. And we have experienced a lot of young adult immigrants being able to relate to us and come to us almost as parents, as brothers and sisters, like blood related, just saying like, hey, you would understand this, hey, I'm going through this. Can I get some help? And for us, it's like, of course, because we understand. They're like, and they have mentioned like, I don't want to have to explain the whole why this is hard, or like, can I just hang out with you guys? I don't want to be like, oh, so what's your accent, or where are you coming from? Like, I just want to be me. Yeah. And it's like, yes, because we want the same. So please come to hang out with us.
Yeah, being a safe place for people who understand and are willing to engage. Yeah. I think, speaking of privileged folks, because you lead privileged folks and other immigrants and people of color who are not from privilege, but like I'm gonna assume a lot of people listening live in pretty homogenous areas, and I think for them, if they're interested in hopefully they are interested in engaging in these justice issues, they might think, well, I don't have to, because there's no one around me that needs this kind of help, right? Which is not true. But speaking to white pastors in places of privilege, what would you say? How can they find and engage with issues like immigration, gentrification, and racism, and any kind of these issues that we're facing today?
I think the starting point is not to, hey, I'm gonna sell my house and I'm gonna move to a space or an area where there's more more heterogeneous population. Some people, for you, that might be what the Lord is asking you to do. But I think before you do that, I think it's starting from a perspective of, if this is a just thing, then it's something that I can and should be participating in. You've used the word shalom a lot, and I think that is a very important thing. If we're kingdom people, one of the things we should be seeking is shalom. So it's not simply for those who are struggling on the wrong side of shalom. It's for everyone. So it's not just, hey, I'm gonna help you out because you're struggling. It's, no, this is what the world should be, and this is what we want to present and what we want to be about as kingdom people. So this is not just for whoever the them are, it's for all of us. So this is not you stepping outside and doing something for somebody else. You're also doing it for yourself. So that's the first thing. The second thing is recognizing that there is a lot that we can do in our own spaces. You have spheres of influence. You have people that you're connected to. You have networks that you're a part of, that if there's some intentionality around it, that you would find ways in which you could affect the culture. Again, without you having to get on a plane, without you having to drive to another neighborhood. There are just ways that you have in your space with the people you're related to, the people that you work with, the people whose your kids go to school with, that there are opportunities to be able to advocate for things that don't require you to do something like Herculean. I think the last thing I'll say is that there is a level of education that's important as well, because the idea, and again, going back to something you said, was about really the Imago Dei being something that's so important, and not just rushing in to help, but just saying, how am I going to use whatever this privilege that I have, whatever these resources that I have, whatever this network that I have, to go and have an effect. Let me do a little bit of understanding of what's going on first before I just kind of barge head first in. And I think that could help eliminate some of the harms that come with folks who have legitimate or great intentions, but because they don't have great missiology, or they didn't take the time to really survey the land or count the cost, then they won't just run headlong in, because a lot of these things that are being faced are difficult, are challenging. They might be new to you, but they are not necessarily new. And if you don't have a full grasp on what it is you're getting yourself into, it can chew you up and spit you out.
Right.
And again, very well-intentioned people going in and saying, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to move into this space. I want to help. And it's like, yes, do that, but understand that this thing might have a long tail to it. Right. This thing might take years to battle, and there may be just small wins along the way. That's okay if you've kind of understood and say, hey, there have been people in this fight for decades, and they're still in it, and the change might just only be marginal. But it's okay, because again, you ground yourself. Is this a just thing? Is this what shalom looks like? Well, then this is something that I can commit myself to doing, and it doesn't have to necessarily turn out in the way that I desire it to, just because my intentions are pure and my passions are high. So yeah, that's just a couple of reflections I have.
Yeah. Copy and paste. That was so good. Yeah. I mean, the education part, I think it's key. I'm so glad you mentioned that there's so many well-intentioned people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the right thing. And I think we get to evidence that because we are in the midst of the work, and how to deal with that. In a way, it's more difficult than if someone was trying to purposely hurt the community. You're like, okay, at least I can call it out, because wrong is wrong, and that's it, But when someone comes with a right heart, but they're doing something that's harmful, it's really hard, because we should also respect their Imago Dei. And I think that's the area where people of color, we need to be really careful, and people in minorities, because in an effort to defend, we switch the coin, we flip the coin, and then we go from the ones that are being hurt to hurting others, and that's, we should always remember, like, yes, does God want justice for me, for my community, for people like me? Yes, but he also cares, and he wants justice for that person, equity. And there's so many people I've met, at least in our community, also with gentrification. I've seen well-intentioned, wonderful human beings moving to our neighborhood, trying to be closer to diversity. And it's so funny because I was going for a walk with one of them the other day, and this person was like, oh, look at that white person with a dog. There used to not be dogs in this neighborhood. And this was a white person that I was walking with. So I'm like, you are also doing the same, so I don't understand. And obviously this person didn't move to our neighborhood thinking, oh, I'm just going to take advantage of the low rent, but there's a long tail in their actions, So I think it takes humility from both sides. I feel like we need to be humble because that's just kind of like the spot that we're at. But for them, it takes a little extra effort because they don't have to be humble. Exactly. They don't have to leave their comfort, So it takes an extra effort to be willing to listen and to understand, and to understand that you can have the best intentions, but the solution might look a completely different way, or it might take way more time than you anticipated. And being able to dwell into the unknown, because that's how it feels like in neighborhoods like ours. There's so much unknown, and you learn to celebrate the tiny victories and still mourn and cry out to the Lord for the big victories that you're hoping to see, So if people are too desperate, usually when there's privilege, there's also the idea of like, well, if I can just fix this, then why wouldn't I do that? Because I'm used to doing that, being able to either pay or work on something that will fix a problem, and it doesn't work that way. So being able to dwell with that frustration and continue to work towards that will be key.
Yeah, I love that you bring up education. As a very privileged individual, being a white man who grew up in the United States in a wealthy part of Austin, Texas, I went to college, and that was the first time I was really exposed to the fact that there are justice issues that exist, things that are not fine. People don't just need to work harder, all these kind of very ignorant beliefs that I grew up having. And when I was first educated about these problems, my another negative side of my privilege kicked in, which was, okay, like, I'm just going to get really angry about this. I'm just going to go and talk. I'm going to get in fights with my family. I'm going to, I'm just going to go dive headfirst into this. And having to take a step back through some very kind rebukes from friends and say, wow, the fact that I get to choose to get angry about this, the fact that to choose to react or try to figure out some sort of fast solution is a privilege in and of itself, that other folks don't have a choice. It is, people that are oppressed need or are advocating for themselves just by nature of existing, right? And so with privilege, like, the good part of privilege is using and leveraging your resources for the sake of those who don't have the same, right?
Right. I would be, if I may say something, yes, I would love to hear if you go through the same. I think as a person of color and a minority, to try to shape that between groups of privilege, if you want to call it, those who are unaware and don't want to leave their bubble, and those who do, but then fight back those who are still in the bubble. It's so hard because you feel like you don't have enough agency, yet you want to bring about peace and equity in a group that kind of feels divided itself. And they don't really have to listen to you if they don't want to. And you're kind of like there trying to bring about theology and, the biblical principles of why that's not probably the best way to react. And I've experienced white folks moving to our church. And then when I worked alongside a wonderful church, extremely privileged church that moved to our neighborhood for a weekend to help me with a outreach event. Must have been the biggest outreach we've had so far. It was incredible to work with them. I totally understand that they won't completely figure out our neighborhood in 3 days, and I'm okay with that. For me, it just says something that they're willing to leave the comfort, to put themselves in a vulnerable place and to say, what do you need us to do? It was so easy to work with them. Like, how do you want to guide us? They were just there serving. And yes, there were comments. There was this one lady that was like, I want you to know I am willing to try food from this neighborhood. I know. Like,
Bless
she was
your
like,
heart.
she was like, I that's literally what I thought. And I'm like literally like staring at her. She's like, I know it's like very dangerous. I know, but I've prepared myself and I am willing to try food. And like my answer was like, in my mind, I'm thinking I could get mad at her because I love this food. Like, are you kidding me? Like, when I don't bring lunch, I go and buy something around here, either Vietnamese or Mexican or Salvadorian. And my answer was like, oh, I would love to try it with you because food here is just delicious, But then this other white person got so mad that started just like judging and kind of condemning, saying like, oh, she's so ignorant. And in my mind, I'm like, aren't we all before education? Aren't we all ignorant? Am I not ignorant of both of your races without receiving education? And same. So I think having that mentality of it will take time and it will take patience from both sides, but we need both sides for this to work out.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think. Did you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what I feel is the biggest way we can move the needle is helping to shape how people think and see these things. Because it absolutely requires that humility in how you're approaching this. And helping people to see that ultimately, as believers in Christ, we're ultimately on the same page. Yeah. The challenge is that we live in a divided nation, and even within the church, there's a divided church. And so there's a lane for us as the people of God to do something distinct in our culture, because there are not a lot of people saying, okay, how do we bring people together? It's a lot of, hey, I'm gonna show you what I'm for, what I'm against. This is my camp, that type of thing. But we also have that in the church because we're very much influenced by the culture, too much influenced by the culture. So the opportunity there is to challenge people to really own that identity that we have as believers and to see and operate in the world as kingdom people. If we can do that, then we can help even some of the infighting that we have, or the either like super virtue signaling or just the wanton ignorance, and how do we even attack those things? How do we address those things in a way that is both grace-filled and justice-filled? Right. But we have to really impress upon our people, kingdom people, who they are and how do we move in this world. Because if not, then we'll take our cues from things outside of the church that are not shalom focused and are very much preserving whatever culture identity camp that I'm in. And then that stuff will continue to leak into the church, and it'll be hard to do good because we can't even get on the same page because we don't know how to talk to each other. Right. We don't know how to have grace when we misstep. Everybody's still vying for that power position, and that's not ultimately helpful in terms of where we're trying to go.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm curious what you two think about this, the idea that the white church in America doesn't really know how to lament well. So when faced with kind of something that causes cognitive dissonance, like police brutality or immigration issues, any kind of injustice, I feel like a lot of privileged folks respond in one of two ways. One is dismissing it and saying that can't really be as bad as it is. Or like I did, back in college, okay, I'm angry. Let's find a solution right now. I believe you, instead of sitting in the tension and feeling the pain and the longing for shalom, like, and so that's something that has a huge biblical precedent in the Old Testament, just sitting and lamenting the problems in the world. Can you speak to that? Because communities of color, communities that are oppressed in America and in the world, lament all the time. I mean, that's you could say, right, that the response to George Floyd and the kind of uproar that it caused is in a way lament. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and American culture is not geared toward lament. It's geared toward overcoming. It's geared toward achievement. And so we just culturally, we don't spend a lot of time sulking or being low or even appreciating that, man, sometimes things just don't work out the way you want them to. So this is, lament is antithetical to our culture. So it's not just privilege, even folks from communities that are not privileged, just a cultural value here is not, let's beat our chest and really just kind of deal with the weight. It's how do I push through? How do I persevere? How do I overcome? We're a culture that gave rise to the prosperity gospel. Why? Because it's like, no, I don't want to be poor. I don't want to be downcast. I don't want to be without. It's, I got to believe differently or whatever so I can get more and I can achieve and I can overcome. So it is fighting an uphill battle. But I believe that is something that we should do. And I believe it's possible to do more if you have proximity to those who have that experience more often. Right. But again, it's against our culture because we build bubbles. We move to neighborhoods where the lawns are immaculate, the schools are immaculate. Any hint of crime, we'll move to another neighborhood where the lawns are even more immaculate, the schools are even more safe, and whatnot. And we'll do that. Or we also, and this is in the social media age, when there are things that are coming up that are worthy of lament, it's almost like we have the scroll mentality where, man, these people were killed in this grocery store. Oh, that's awful. Tomorrow, Top Gun's coming out. And that's the thing we talk about. And then, oh man, these kids were gunned down in the school. Oh, that's awful. And tomorrow, oh, we have an election. Who are we going to vote for?
Right.
And so there's not even an attention span to be able to sit in it. So there are a lot of things that get in the way of us being able to lament. And so there's a level of intentionality and proximity to, if you don't have it directly in your life, I think more people do than want to let on, but moving into those spaces and being willing to just sit there and not trying to just get past it, I think is an important thing to do, but it's definitely a challenge because culturally we're not wired to do that.
Yeah, like weeping with those who weep.
Yeah,
I mean, a direct.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's a certain level of pride with that type of response, and I've been able to evidence that since I moved here. I remember moving to the U.S. and before I moved here, the U.S. it's the reference for the rest of the world. All the movies, shows, everything. You're able to see not just the story that's being portrayed, but you see the city itself, the streets, markets, whatever that show is showing to you. So the idea that we have of the U.S. is like, wow, there's not trash in the in the city, like it's pretty clean, and wow, the schools are like, wow, immaculate. They have computers for everyone. They have the gym. They have, everything's so clean, and even with people, each person almost having their own car, and it just everything, it just shows. Ultimately, what I believe it's a mask, and it's not until I moved here that I started realizing, wow. little by little, I'm starting to see the moments where that mask is slightly falling off, and the country just does this, put it back, because we need to be perfect. We need to be, we're a first world country. We, and all the actual beautiful things that this country does have, but because of that, it has gone to an extreme where there's almost no room to lament, to sit to dwell almost in what's uncertain, what's painful, what we should mourn about. And because if we don't do that, then we're not recognizing it. And if we don't recognize it, we don't name it.
Right.
And if we don't name it, we're never going to fix it, because
Right.
there's nothing there. Unless you name something, that something doesn't exist. So unless you say, hey, this is discrimination, we're not going to address it because there's nothing, you haven't named
Right.
it, So, yeah, I think I see a mask, and I always wonder, when is this going to ultimately fall?
Yeah.
And that's going to be scary. And I think as church leaders, if we don't start shaping and really pushing for lament, people are going to be, if the mask ultimately falls, people are going to be left with like, what is this? Because I don't know this feeling. This, like, lamenting feels like a defeat. It feels like I didn't achieve. It feels like we're not this powerful nation, and it doesn't. It doesn't. Jesus lamented.
Yeah.
And that didn't make him any weaker. It just made him realize there is the struggles, but there is a bigger God than those struggles. And I
Yeah.
think there's a huge lesson for the U.S. in that in order to be this powerful, great nation doesn't mean that they cannot recognize and sit down with those who are weeping, because that happens on a daily basis. It's just that you probably have the privilege to scroll down your
Yeah.
phone or turn off the TV. And so many people make those comments, they're like, oh, too much negativity. I just closed my Facebook, too much negativity, I just turned my TV off because too much negativity. It's like, well, the negativity, if you want to call it that, it's still there. It's that you're just deciding not to see it because it probably doesn't affect you. So if you turning your computer off or your phone off stops that means you're not being affected by it. Because guess what? There's people that have to deal with that even after they turn their TVs off. The issue is pretty much there. So they have no other choice but to fight back or lament in the middle of that.
Yeah, like to acknowledge these issues is to confess that they exist, and to confess the structural and historic nature of them, right? I've been reading Jamar Tisby's Color of Compromise, and he is talking about in basically 200-300 years ago during slavery, a lot of the white churches' attitude was, well, yeah, we're not really going to talk about this. Racism, as an example, is a personal issue. Well, if I don't actually engage, if I don't, and that's shockingly similar to the arguments that you hear today, right? Is, well, I never used that language. Well, I didn't shoot anyone in a police uniform. And that's a way of scrolling right past these issues instead of saying and confessing, like, these are systemic, and even when God calls out his people in the Bible, it is his people. It is, you have not come together as a community,
Right.
Not you individual did and you didn't maybe, and it was. There is a problem of injustice.
Right.
You are all responsible for
Right.
the healing, and especially now in the kingdom of God as we're empowered by the Holy Spirit, right?
Right.
I want to kind of transition to talking about being small, and a lot of people, especially, we talk about in this podcast a lot that the desire, at least feeling the need to grow bigger. If you're not growing in numbers of people rapidly, then you're not successful. And a lot of people don't really explicitly say that, but we kind of say it with our, all of our resources, and all of our conferences are led by people who pastor churches that are just, they don't know what it's like to get sick and have no one else fill in for you, like you were saying.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the value, though, of being small. What does that uniquely allow you to do in formation, discipleship, and mission in your churches?
I believe it's easier to identify and address many of the social issues when you're small. Not address with resources, because when you're small, you don't have a lot of resources. But I think because of the proximity that you have, and nothing against mega churches, but if you're in a mega church and someone doesn't show up, you probably won't realize if you're the pastor. It'd be really weird if you realized. You do realize, at least at Westside, you do realize when a family didn't come, someone didn't come. So it's way easier to address it and just kind of say, like, how are you? I realized that you weren't here. And then you have the time, and I do this because then you also don't have the time, But to address it and to say, I realize you weren't here. So people feel more seen and you are able to see them. I admire pastors from big churches because I could not do that. I could not take care of that many people in a good way if I was a pastor of a big church. I could not, because it takes more than the say hi to your neighbor on Sunday. There's so many layers. If you ultimately want to bring shalom, there's so many more layers than, okay, how many people did we have on Sunday? How many, how many people came to the food bank? There's so many more layers. And when you're small, you're able to see that because you don't have the resources. It kind of becomes a blessing that you don't have enough resource to, feed 10,000 people in a food bank, but you can feed 60 families. So you will know them by name. You will know their kids. You will be able to speak to their kids, teach them a Bible lesson. You would not be able to do that if they were in the hundreds. So that is, I feel like, a big blessing. The proximity, you're able to realize when people are not there. You're able to realize and meet their needs in a more tangible way.
That's really beautiful.
Amen to what you said. Especially with the proximity, I think there's an idea of community that's there. And, with us living in a much more globalized society, community is not something that is necessarily baked into the cake with churches anymore in America. But when you have a smaller church, you can get to that royal jelly of community, I think, a little bit easier. It doesn't require the amount of programming and organizing and whatnot, because it's just us here. So you see and people, you have that proximity. So I think that's a huge advantage. Another advantage, I believe, of being smaller is that, and this is also smaller and church planty, is that you can do things that maybe in larger churches you could not do.
Yes. That's
so like at our church, we will have a communion meal for the service, like once a quarter. No preaching, no singing. It's not. We would go up in the cafeteria, and we'll have a meal, and in the midst of the meal we'll celebrate communion. Like logistically, I don't know how you do that if you have 10,000 people.
Yes, I agree.
You're trying to feed that many people. That's crazy. But we have some of that license to be able to move and do some different things in that way. And I appreciate that about being smaller. Another advantage, and you kind of spoke to this, is not being a large church, because there's some other stuff that comes with being a large church. So matters that are affecting the church typically are just handled by people in the church. When you are really large and have a large presence, matters in the church now have eyeballs on it of people who don't go to the church. You have people speaking into the situation without knowing what all is going on. And you almost have to speak to those people and so that just creates like really, really like all kinds of complexities. Like I'm not a fan of being famous.
Oh yeah.
And I think that gives some, I don't know, it helps when things are local. You can handle things locally when you're not huge, and that's a big advantage. And I think one other thing I just think about is that when you don't have tons of financial resources, the people who are working and are there, you pretty much know they're committed to the mission.
Yeah.
They're not there for a job.
Right.
because it's like, shit, we can't
That's
pay
not
you.
right.
Yeah, or we
Including
pay you.
yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're not about to you're not gonna ball out
Right.
by coming with us.
Right.
Whereas in some other situations, it's like, oh, it's a job, and
Right.
I don't like this. I'm gonna go and get another job.
Right.
Yeah, we don't even have the luxury
That's
of even
true.
offering those types of situations.
Yeah.
And so you get a little bit more missional clarity, or even
Yes.
missional purity, if you want to use that that idea,
so good.
in terms of people who are there. They're there because they at least say or think they believe in the mission. Now, that don't mean everybody that comes in actually wants to carry it out.
Right.
But you don't have to worry about, are you just here for the check?
Right. Right.
Or are you just here for the platform? It's like, I ain't got no platform to give you.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to hear and grind, we got that.
Right.
You want to get in these streets, we got that.
Right.
But, you're not going to build a huge following off of being associated to whatever we're doing here.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a secondary advantage that I think you would benefit from being smaller.
There's that feeling of not feeling like a little part of a huge machine.
Mm-hmm.
Like in other churches, especially like obviously big churches, you're like, well, my area is this. When this person comes, they've already gone through step 1, 2, and 3. I'm 4, and then I pass them to 5 and 6, and they become church members, Right. When you are in a church plant, you're like in 1, and then you move to 2, and then you move to 3. It's like flipping patties in McDonald's or something. So you're in the middle of that, and it's so hard, but at the same time, it's so gratifying to see the fruit, because you see the person in every single step. And because you have to be involved one way or another in every single step, you're able to see that growth and that fruit. And it's very gratifying.
Yeah.
Awesome. The last thing before we wrap up, you mentioned something I think really important, which is both of your churches are safe places for people who are going through things that a lot of other folks don't understand, to just sit and kind of be. And we also talked about the value of education especially for privileged folks, for the sake of understanding issues on a bigger level, and how to engage well-meaning folks, how to engage, and that it's long and slow and hard. Can you talk about some resources that are out there that people could go to books, I don't know, podcasts, sermons, something out there? Because I feel like what I saw a lot during kind of the recent George Floyd protests and all the wake, all the things that happened in the wake of that. A lot of people saying, I don't want to keep explaining right now. I just want to kind of be able to sit in this. So if people were interested in learning and being educated about these issues, what are some resources that you know of that they could go to?
I think my answer has changed over time.
Okay.
Like I had a document with all kinds of YouTubes and podcasts and different things that people could go to, books they could read and listen to. And I think if you want it, that information's out there. For me, it's more about the heart formation. And so I would say, go back and look and read through the Gospels and see when Jesus was talking about the kingdom, what was he talking about? What was he asking those folks to do? When the Pharisees and the tax collectors were coming out to see John the Baptist, and he's saying, repent, you brood of vipers and all of this. And they were like, okay, how do we do it? And he was like, soldiers, stop hitting people upside the head. Tax collectors, only take, what you need. Just diving back into that.
Yeah.
And if you start there and you have that perspective and that heart formation, then you can get to some of the more practical things. I think because the stories and the traumas and all of those things have been so national, at this point, it's not like I have no idea what's going on, or I have no idea that this might be an issue. So for me, it's more about, well, how do you see the world? What do you think your role is to play in this? What do you think your role as a believer is to play in this? And get some clarity there. And once you have clarity there, I think it will help you navigate as you're taking in a resource. So I could say, yeah, go read Tisby's Color of Compromise. But if you're not convinced that this is something you should be doing, you're just reading a book.
Yep.
Right.
More information.
Yeah, just more information. And so it really is about, well, like, what do you think you should be doing?
Yeah.
And once you get that squared away, then the resources, you'll Google will take you straight to where you need to be.
Yeah.
But for me, it's really about that heart formation and fully and having clarity about what is my role as a kingdom citizen.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you ask for resources, my whole master's is about justice, biblical justice. So I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so much material out there. But I do agree that the heart needs to be prepared for that. And I love that you brought us back to the Gospels, because you can see so much of Jesus' character, especially in the Gospel of Luke, the biblical justice, that he addresses constantly. And I would go further and say, go back to read the Old Testament in the law of Moses. There is so much of biblical justice in the middle of that, with the gleaning law, the year of Jubilee, just all those things that speak about equity versus equality, and those who are the group of three, which sometimes it's four, the poor, the widow, the oppressed, the foreigner, constantly over and over again in the law, God is, if you neglect those, they will cry out to me and I will listen, and I have a Latin mom and a Latin dad. And when you were little, if they say like, hey, if you make your little sister cry, and I will listen. That's all they would say. And you'd be like, oh, shoot, like I better not misbehave or something. They don't even have to tell you the consequences. Yeah. Just them saying they will hear. That's enough. So when I read that, with so much emphasis in the Old Testament, it just makes me realize how important it is for God that he does see the most vulnerable. He does see those who are most marginalized and neglected in society. And I'm trying to remember what author said, in order to be completely unbiased, God has to be biased towards the most neglected ones. It's not that he has preference or favoritism, but he has to show favoritism to them, because the scale is not well calibrated. They're down here. So he has to show favoritism to those who are most neglected, most vulnerable, to bring them to an equity part so he can treat everyone the same way, So, and that is so important to know, hey, who are those who are crying out around us? Who are those that are crying out and God is listening, And what you were saying, I might not be personally doing something to them, but what is me living in this place, me going to this school, me driving in this direction, me eating this food, me disposing this garbage, me, working where I work, how is this affecting my neighbor? And I would go even, again, because this is the U.S. and it has so much power over the world, I wouldn't just close it in the country. The U.S. impacts the whole world. So if something's not affecting you personally, doesn't mean it's not affecting your neighbor. And your neighbor could be someone in Bolivia, in Uganda, and it is your neighbor. It is your brother and sister. So not to bring stress, because, we could think like, all right, then I need to think my every step, but just be thoughtful that what you do impacts people, and impacts people that are loved by God, that are created in the same image and likeness of God as you are. So what you do impacts them. So it does matter, since you have privilege, just because both of our feet are stepping in this specific place of the world, we have privilege. We all have privilege. How is that going to play? What role is that going to play with the rest of the world? Because it already impacts it. It's just a matter of we're going to impact it in a good way or in a bad way.
Amazing. I think that's it. Misha and Derrick, thank you so much.
Thank
for coming on.
you.
Thank you for your wisdom. This is amazing. I'm so excited about this episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Kanan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Creasel. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.